Hi, Shannon Looney back to talk to you a little bit more about what we did with our data and how we turned it into graphs for us to make better observations about what it all means and tying it together. So let's look at our first graph of GDP and unemployment. We can see that as GDP has a decrease, we're going to see an increase in unemployment levels. Conversely, when we see a decline in unemployment, we'll see an increase in GDP. There appears to be a strong correlation, going back to what we discussed earlier, of 0.7917. And this shows that unemployment has a direct influencing effect on GDP. However, when we look at GDP and the relationship it has with employment levels, we should naturally see that increased employment should also mean increased GDP, but we don't necessarily see that. There does seem to be an emergence of an equilibrium that starts to take effect in the later years. We can tell that between 15,000 and 10,000 employed individuals in the transportation sector does result in an increase in GDP. We'll probably need to look at the coming decades to see if this equilibrium trend tends to emerge and what effects will then be had on employment and if the relationship is stronger. Going back to my earlier mention that it has a low correlation of 0.2413, so there is a relationship, but it's not very distinct. This is probably due to the need for an equilibrium, which we'll be able to identify more later. The next thing that we're going to look at is GDP, unemployment, and employment levels all put together in the same slide. So that way we can understand exactly what they're doing together. We can see that as employment levels rise and unemployment levels decrease, GDP tends to also increase. We can also observe the contrary to that. As employment levels drop, we'll also see unemployment levels rise, and GDP tends to drop as well. But we can also observe that GDP is steadily increasing over time, meaning that these shifts don't really have as much of a bearing as to make the industry itself moot, which is a good thing because we all rely on transportation for everything that we need in our day-to-day life. Next, we're going to be discussing CPI and unemployment. As we look at CPI, we're going to wonder whether or not employment levels will have a direct impact on the cost of that for us, the consumer. We can see that as unemployment levels tend to increase, we'll see CPI also slowly increase. Over time, though, it seems that this is the strongest correlating variable that we have that seems to be naturally understood as prices increase as a direct result from unemployment, meaning the goods and services are not being delivered to us, making the prices go even higher, or there's a scarcity, meaning that there are fewer items to be obtained, so the prices increase. Next, let's look at CPI and levels of employment. We can see that CPI is low when employment is high. CPI has steadily increased, though, and that's because of natural inflation that occurs over time. It's hard to infer exactly what this means for the connection, though. It's the weakest of our connections, coming in at 0.163. There is a connection there, but is it influenced because of inflation that occurs naturally over time? It's undetermined. Thank you, and we'll take it over to Keela for our next video summarizing the results and conclusions of our findings.